Hello and welcome everyone to our panel. We are going to wait a couple of more minutes until everyone arrives. And Alena, are we already online or live on Facebook?
We are just about to start the live stream. There we are.
Okay, thank you. Okay, then again, hello and welcome to our panel, arriving from the Sea to the City for Concrete Corridors of Solidarity. I'm Christian and I'm working with Europe Must Act, and I'm a representative of the From the Sea to the City consortium, and I'm going to moderate this panel today. Yeah, I just want to introduce and say a few words about Europe Must Act, the organization I'm working with. Europe Must Act is a grassroots movement which was founded by volunteers on the Greek islands in March last year. And we are a member of the From the Sea to the City consortium and also involved in organizing this conference. Europe Must Act is working on different levels. One is, of course, because we're founded on the islands and we are NGO workers and volunteers. One is to collect evidence and information on the ground. On the other hand, we are doing advocacy work on an EU level in Brussels. And through our more than 50 city chapters all over Europe, we are running a broad variety of campaigns. Our key demands are relocation, especially looking at the situation in the camps in Greece. And of course, dignified reception conditions and a humane migration policy, which is pretty much the same goals like this consortium has. Maybe a few words about this this panel today. Sorry, I just lost track. I wanted to introduce the Q&A part or feature of Zoom. You can find it below in the middle on your screen. If you would like to ask questions or give comments, please add these questions to the Q&A or to the chat feature. This panel will last around 75 minutes, and we have to keep track on the time because there are other panels following up after this. Towards our panelists, of course, I'm going to ask you initial questions, but whenever you want to give a direct answer on what was said by another panelist, please feel free to do that by raising your hand or just open your microphone and start to speak. Yeah, regarding the topic, I would like to give a very short introduction on the situation in Europe right now, just to sum up where we are at right now. As you may all know, refugees and asylum seekers face fundamental rights abuse in Europe, all across the border regions. There are pushbacks happening on the sea and land. There are camps without access to basic needs. And more what we see is prison-like camps, for example, on the Greek islands and the Greek mainland and other areas in Europe. On a political side, we see that the European Union is not willing or not able to agree on a welcoming asylum and migration system. And the new pact on migration and asylum, which was proposed by the European Union or the European Commission in September last year, would actually create an even more complex system and a more inhumane situation for refugees and asylum seekers in Europe. On top of that, the COVID pandemic and climate change is forcing more and more people to leave their homes and force them to leave their homes on one of the deadliest refugee routes in the whole world, which is the Mediterranean Sea. And of course, other ways to Europe, like through the Aegean Sea and the Balkan region, which are also very, very dangerous routes to reach a dignified living condition. This panel today, as already announced, is part of the Palermo conference, which is organized by the From the Sea to the City consortium. This conference is a hybrid conference taking place in Palermo and online, like this session today. The conference started yesterday with a meeting of mayors from all over Europe. 12 mayors met in Palermo physically, and 21 other mayors and city representatives met online. And they had a roundtable discussion about the active role that cities can play in the reception of refugees. The key moment yesterday was the signing of a joint statement of the mayors in the evening. And today the panels are mostly online. Panels were talking about learning from welcoming cities in Europe, the cooperation between cities and civil society, direct funding for cities, for welcoming cities by the EU. And we have two more panels tonight. One is focusing on human rights violations by Frontex and the EU. And at the very end, we have a networking session for activists and civil society organizations later this evening. The From the Sea to the City consortium was founded in 2018 within the discussion or a meeting about the Palermo Charter process, which took place in Palermo in May 2018. And the idea of the consortium is to send a strong signal from civil society organizations and cities towards the European institutions. The idea is to pursue a welcoming and human rights-based migration and refugee policies in Europe. This panel today about corridors of solidarity is more or less a follow-up meeting or a follow-up discussion on a panel which happened last year in October. Don't worry, there's no need to re-watch the video from last year before joining this call here or this discussion, but it's still available online. So if you are interested, please watch this video after this meeting to get more information about what was happening last year. In general, last year the discussion was more abstract about how corridors of solidarity could work in general. The idea for this panel today is to talk about practical and concrete solutions. Speaking about corridors of solidarity, I want to give you a very short introduction what corridors of solidarity are. The definition says that corridors of solidarity are safe, efficient, and legal corridors for arrival and reception with European municipalities at its center. A good summary is also safe passages, safe harbors, and safe transit to a dignified life, which is more or less the whole route that people on the run need to go to reach a dignified living condition. What we should keep in mind is that corridors can be creative and unconventional to be implemented as soon as possible, because this is, like I already said, this is the other side or another perspective on migration. As the EU Commission, for example, has, because they're already discussing new policies and new policy ideas for years now, and they are not reaching any conclusion or any agreement. On the other hand, corridors should be or could be implemented immediately. And please keep in mind that corridors already exist. Very often you can't see that there's a corridor or that there's a community or a group of people who is already practicing this kind of solidarity. The idea is to connect these groups and these places of solidarity. Then I'm happy to give a short introduction to our panelists today. welcome Maximiliane Gleissner from Munich. Maximiliane is working with Seebruecke in Munich, and she's in Munich today. Then welcome to Maurice Stierl. He's a researcher at the University of Warwick, and he's part of the alarm phone team and a representative for the CIML MRCC, which is a Maritime Rescue and Coordination Center. And Maurice is here in Palermo, and I'm in Palermo too. Sorry, I think I didn't mention that before. And then welcome Mr. Salvatore Martello. He's the mayor of Lampedusa, and he's joining us also from Palermo today. Now I'm happy to start the first round of discussion and interventions. And what I'm going to do now is ask questions to all of our panelists to understand what their work is about, always with a focus on practical solutions for corridors of solidarity. I would like to hand over the word to Maurice and would like to ask you if you could explain the idea of alarm phone, and please explain what a civil MRCC actually is.
Thank you, Christian. Thanks everyone for having me. It's a pleasure to be here in Palermo. And I will get to the alarm phone and the MRCC in a second, but I want to provide a little bit of context before doing so. The Palermo Charter process, as people may not know, started in Palermo in 2018, when a range of actors came together for the first time, including members of the search and rescue community, activists who engage along migratory corridors throughout Europe, as well as progressive municipalities and cities. And these actors came together to think very clearly about concrete corridors of solidarity that should stretch from the sea to the cities, right? And also the slogan was coined in this Palermo Charter process. This whole process is inspired by the Charter of Palermo, which declares the right of mobility for everyone, and is a very important document that is based on principles on justice, equality, and solidarity. And so this coalition came together also at a very significant political moment in mid-2018, as it was the moment when the right-wing government coalition between Lega and Five Stars was formed, right? And so this very moment had also repercussions for the situation in the Central Mediterranean Sea. Besides Italy, European member states chose to withdraw even further from search and rescue activities, and instead they reinforced their presence in the skies, right, to monitor migrant movements and to inform their Libyan allies, who would then chase after them with speedboats, quite often donated by Italy, in order to stop and prevent migrant crossings and to abduct them into inhumane conditions in Libya. And this practice has continued, and just this year, so over the first 6 months or so, over 14,000 people have been returned in this way. And of course, at the same time, we see that death at sea is continuing, and also people who go missing without being ever officially accounted for, right? And we have seen shipwrecks occur even when the location of the migrants in distress was known to authorities for hours and sometimes even for days. So European authorities have not only withdrawn from rescues, they've also systematically failed to coordinate rescues, neither in international waters nor within European search and rescue zones. Very frequently, MRCCs, so Maritime Rescue Coordination Centers, really fail to adequately respond to distress situations. And at times, even in the case of Malta in particular, emergency phone lines cannot even be reached. So instead of coordinating rescues, they spend their energies and resources to manufacture and orchestrate mass captures of people on the move and their return to Libya. Or at times they just leave migrants non-assisted and abandoned at sea. And also right now, today, we have such a case in the Maltese search and rescue zone where a boat is left in distress. So besides failing to rescue and coordinate rescue, we have seen how state authorities have focused energies on harassing and criminalizing NGOs who still want to rescue. You know, quite clearly, the European authorities want to break a chain of solidarity that has been fostered in the Mediterranean space over the last 6 years, including people on the move, rescue NGOs, civil aircraft that monitor from the sky, and the alarm phone emergency hotline. We have also, at the same time, we have seen, you know, and the whole history of struggle in the Mediterranean tells us that if one thing is clear is that migrant movements will continue, and so will solidarity at sea. So we have seen a rise in autonomous arrivals, right, with people trying to find their own way, given the lack of rescue at sea. So for 2020, the UNHCR has noted 34,000 arrivals in Europe via the Central Mediterranean corridor. Of these 34,000 arrivals, 4,500 were rescued, and the UNHCR notes the others were intercepted by authorities close to shore or arrived undetected. So this is very important, right? It shows that the majority of people reached Europe independently. And of those 4,500 rescues, over 3,700 people were rescued by the NGOs, which means that in total only 800 people were properly rescued by state authorities. That's a percentage of 2%. So given this very obvious dysfunctionality of state maritime rescue coordination centers, members of the search and rescue community are now proposing something that you mentioned in the beginning, Christian, which is the civil MRCC, right? This Civil Maritime Rescue Coordination Center. And I don't really have the time now, I think, to highlight in great detail this project, but you can read about it on the website civilmrcc.eu. And just to say so much, the civil MRCC involves actors that have collectively rescued or helped rescue tens of thousands of lives over recent years, search and rescue NGOs, civil aerial assets, and the alarm phone hotline. This means that the CMRCC has a lot of experience and de facto exists already for many years. But in this new CMRCC frame, we want to give a collective character to this project, which is a means to coordinate and document people in distress in the Central Mediterranean. The aim of this network is, of course, a quick rescue of people in distress. And for the CMRCC network, it's quite clear that a rescue means a rescue to a port of safety, a place of safety, right? And the CMRCC will aspire to that and connect with other networks and actors to make it happen. But of course, we can also not simply stop at the point of disembarkation in Europe, right? In places such as Lampedusa. We know that the struggle will continue afterwards. And so the slogan from the sea to the cities does not mean, staying at the place of disembarkation. People on the move themselves often have a very good sense of where they want to go in Europe, right? Where they have family ties, friends, where they have linguistic, religious, cultural, and other communities, places of work, and so on. So building corridors of solidarity means understanding and supporting also these sort of autonomous, independent ways in which people struggle to find their own way, and through these sort of forms of relocation from below, if you will. So despite Dublin, people leave places of first arrival, and we've known this for many years now, right? So rather than just focusing on sort of bringing them here through institutional actors and actions, which is really important, and I really like this conference that takes place here, at the same time, we need to think beyond that and think about solidarity structures that need to be created at the levels of grassroots and social movements that support people on the move while they are traveling and making these corridors of solidarities. So I will end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maurice, and thanks for giving some more details about the Palermo Charter process. Yeah, speaking about cities where people then arrived after they were rescued, I would like to hand over to Maximiliane and ask you to give us a short overview about what Seebruecke is doing in Germany and which concrete goals you and your group in Munich already accomplished.
Yes, thank you very much, and thanks everyone for coming. Sometimes my internet goes a bit funny, so please bear with me if I slow down for a moment. First, I just want to say something generally about Seebruecke, and then more specifically about Munich, which is one of the largest cities in Germany in the southeast, not far from Italy, I guess. Yeah, so Seebruecke is primarily based in Germany, but it can be considered a European-wide network of local initiatives that campaign for safe passage for refugees. Some of our core demands are to stop the criminalization of civil sea rescue operations and also the immediate evacuation of all camps at Europe's external borders. And while the EU and national governments are failing refugees and migrants, we are trying to develop strategies of solidarity that work across Europe. So in a way, you could say Seebruecke is also a Northern European campaign, because obviously the situation for us who do not live close to the Mediterranean, to the border, is very different to countries like Italy or Spain that are actually bordering on the Mediterranean. Our aim is, that's our overarching aim at the moment, to find local solutions in support of human rights. So migration is a global process, but we try to find local solutions that work wherever you go. So each community is different, every city is different, and that's our starting point. Everybody brings different strengths and weaknesses. Yeah, and it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's meant to come from, yeah, bottom up. And well, like I've just implied, we believe that cities can play a crucial role in bringing about a positive change in Europe's treatment of refugees and migrants more generally. Now, looking at the situation in Munich, Munich is actually one of over 250 cities, towns, communities in Germany that have become or declared themselves a sicherer Hafen, which is German for safe harbor. And it's the symbolic idea that we here in the north of Europe, we can also be a safe place for refugees to come and settle here and rebuild their lives. And yeah, like one of the core points is that Munich says we are able to take in and welcome more people than existing quotas as defined by the state or by the national government say. So far, however, all attempts on the local level to welcome more people have been blocked by the German national government, and this is sort of one of the main points we're working on as a big network in Germany. As an intermediate step in Munich, one thing we've tried to do is to adopt or like develop a sponsorship for a rescue ship called Ocean Viking, which is operated by the NGO SOS Méditerranée. However, I'd say from our perspective, even though we've come a far way here in Munich and we have a good cooperation with our council, we can still do a lot more. Sometimes I feel like we have a very good relationship with our city administration. I think this is very interesting and they work really hard. One of the main people in the city administration, he's actually in Palermo as well. But for us, it feels like the politicians in Munich, sometimes they're reluctant, or maybe they just lack ideas how they can actually build up corridors of solidarity and connect and link up with cities like Lampedusa or Palermo in Italy. And this is definitely something I'm hoping for today, that I'll be able to take some ideas back to our local politicians how we can strengthen our ties with other communities in Italy at the border, so that we can actually get to the point where we can realize relocation and resettlement to Munich. I hope this all makes sense, but if you have any questions, you can just put them in the chat and I'll try to answer them later.
Okay, thank you very much, Maximiliane. And then again, hello and welcome, Mr. Martello. Yeah, we spoke about search and rescue in the Mediterranean, and we talked about cities, welcoming cities in Northern Europe, speaking about Munich. And yeah, Lampedusa is more or less in between. It's the place where people arrive. Okay, sorry, the translation is on. Sorry, I had another voice on my ear. Yeah, I would like to ask you, Mr. Martello, could you please give a short update about the situation on the islands? Because as we all know and see, Lampedusa is on the news a lot during the last weeks again. It would be really nice if you could give us a short update about the current situation. And then we would really like to know if there's an example that you can talk about where civil society and the municipality of Lampedusa work together in solidarity on the island of Lampedusa.
Un esempio in cui la società civile di Lampedusa ha lavorato insieme.
Grazie. Dall'inizio dell'anno ad oggi noi abbiamo avuto a Lampedusa qualcosa come 20.000 persone che sono sbarcate, su 34.000, come diceva la collega, che ne sono sbarcati in Europa. E questo dimostra che in rapporto al 2020 abbiamo avuto il doppio degli sbarchi. E ancora l'estate non è incominciata perché il tempo è stato incerto e quindi ci sono stati sbarchi solo alcune giornate in tutto questo periodo.
Thank you very much. The first thing I'd like to say is that this year so far there have already been 20,000 arrivals in Lampedusa out of 34,000 in Europe, and this is twice the amount of what we saw in 2020, and still for the relevant period. And the summer period still hasn't really started. We still haven't had the daily arrivals as before.
Noi ormai siamo abituati a parlare quotidianamente e sempre di emergenza. L'emergenza dei migranti non può continuare eternamente a sentire questo termine, perché ormai è da 30 anni che si sente sull'isola di Lampedusa, dal 1993. E quindi c'è bisogno intanto di cambiare anche la stessa terminologia del fenomeno che noi stiamo affrontando. Quello che stiamo attualmente vedendo è solo ed esclusivamente l'emergenza per l'accoglienza.
We talk all the time about an emergency and a migrant emergency, but we can't continue to speak about it in this way. It's been 20 years now since 1993 that we speak about the emergency for migrants in Lampedusa, and really we need to change the terminology by now, because what we're seeing is an emergency of how we welcome people, an emergency in reception.
Che cosa succede con l'emergenza? L'altro giorno, una settimana fa, un pescatore di Lampedusa, che è anche consigliere comunale, ha salvato 24 persone a 40 miglia da Lampedusa. Il risultato di questo salvamento è stato che si è beccata una denuncia da parte della Capitaneria di Porto, perché era uscito fuori le miglia stabilite per legge come piccole imbarcazioni. È andato a 40 miglia.
An example of this is just 1 week ago, a fisherman in Lampedusa, who was also part of the town council, rescued 24 people at sea who are only 40 nautical miles from Lampedusa. And the reaction he got from this was he is being accused of a crime by the head of the local port in relation to going out of bounds on a small fishing ship.
Quindi da un lato l'idea che c'è sull'isola, infatti l'abbiamo dimostrato con una maglietta scrivendo io sono pescatore, e dall'altro lato la risposta dello Stato che penalizza coloro i quali cercano di salvare. E questo è un argomento importante perché poi gira attorno a tutto il sistema europeo che riguarda l'accoglienza.
So what we see is a division on the island, because on the one hand, we've printed T-shirts saying, I am a fisherman. On the other hand, the state authorities are criminalizing this man's actions. And this is really important because it brings us back to the entire European approach and European system to migration.
L'Europa non ha una strategia, non ha una politica sul fenomeno delle migrazioni. E la stessa cosa non ce l'ha neanche l'Italia e gli altri paesi europei.
Europe doesn't have a strategy for welcoming or dealing with migrants. Neither does Italy and neither do any of the European member states.
La politica dell'Unione Europea è concentrata solo ed esclusivamente sul fenomeno dei rifugiati. E questo significa che non avendo tutte le discussioni che noi continuiamo a fare, come si dice, servono per ingannare l'opinione pubblica, perché da un lato quando si parla di redistribuzione si inganna la gente dicendo che si stanno redistribuendo i migranti e dall'altro lato invece non è vero, perché poi le nazioni dove ci sono gli sbarchi devono farsi carico dei cosiddetti migranti economici che sbarcano o che arrivano nei diversi paesi europei, come la Spagna, come l'Italia e come Malta e in altri posti di frontiera.
In reality, in truth, Europe only has a policy about refugees, not about migrants. And this means all of the discussions that take place are there to really trick the public. And they trick the public in two ways. On the one hand, by making people think that there is some kind of redistribution of everyone throughout Europe. And on the other hand, because it means that the border states like Spain, Italy, and Malta and others have to deal with the migrants who are left there.
Anche l'accordo di Malta tra alcune nazioni europee e l'Italia è orientato solo esclusivamente sui rifugiati, però nessuno l'ha detto, nessuno ha informato l'opinione pubblica che si parlava di rifugiati.
For example, the Malta Agreement between some European states and Malta and Italy only speaks about refugees, and the public weren't informed of the fact that it wasn't about migrants, but just refugees specifically.
La risposta a questo della politica europea è quella che nell'ultimo documento che è stato presentato a Bruxelles, che è stato anche oggetto di discussione tra alcuni paesi di frontiera. Mi ricordo c'è stato un convegno dove c'era la van der Leyen, la Johansson e c'era anche Schmidt, mi pare, tedesco, ed altri deputati europei. L'unica cosa che veniva fuori è che i migranti cosiddetti economici, dove sbarcano, devono restare per aspettare poi di essere rimpatriati. Ora dico io, la politica sui rimpatri in Europa, ma nel caso specifico in Italia, fondamentalmente esiste con un solo paese che è la Tunisia, che durante la settimana, durante un mese, ne possono ricevere se no 100-150. Se noi in un giorno abbiamo avuto 2400 persone che sono arrivate a Lampedusa, in quale secolo riusciranno a rimpatriare tutti?
Quello è bello questa discussione tra i questi
a Bruxelles, sulla proposta che ha fatto la Johansson a Bruxelles.
So, when there were discussions in Brussels with Johansson and other European politicians about the latest document for migrant policy, all of the discussion eventually concluded that economic migrants will have to wait in the place where they land and then be deported back to their countries. And we can see how sad this is because this only really exists currently for Tunisia, where Tunisia will accept 100, 150 people to be deported every week. But if 2,000 people arrive in Lampedusa in one day from Tunisia, the question is, in which century will all of the migrants be able to be deported? This century or the next?
E questo era l'esempio di accoglienza che vuole fare nascere l'Unione Europea, nel senso che se a Lampedusa arrivano, come sono arrivati in questo periodo, 20.000 migranti, cioè i 20.000 migranti dovrebbero restare sull'isola di Lampedusa, nel senso che noi è un'isola che è 32 km quadrati, che ospita 6.500 abitanti, dovrebbe ospitare tutti i migranti che arrivano sull'isola. In poche parole, l'idea era quello di trasformare diciamo, i posti di sbarco uguali identici a quello che succede a Lesbo, perché a Lesbo c'è un centro di accoglienza che ne ospita 12.000, 13.000, eccetera, dove non vengono rispettati, non solo a Lesbo, ma in tutti gli altri posti dove c'è il sovraffollamento, non vengono rispettati né il diritto sanitario e neanche gli elementi minimi di rispetto nei confronti delle persone che arrivano in Europa, nel caso specifico nelle aree di frontiera.
So we see here a real example of what the EU means by welcoming and reception. If 20,000 people arrive in Lampedusa, the idea is that they're meant to stay on Lampedusa, despite it being a small island with a small population. And the real point of all of this, it seems, is to try and transform places of arrival like Lampedusa into places of arrival like Lesbos, places in which there isn't respect for human rights, there's massive overcrowding, people's access to healthcare isn't guaranteed, and there isn't respect for people in general who traverse the borders.
Lo sforzo che viene fatto da parte di ognuno di noi, ognuno gioca una sua parte del suo territorio, ma anche vorrebbe avere risultati anche politicamente e dal punto di vista generale. Viene vanificato perché è semplice, nessuno ha intenzione di aprire dei corridoi regolari. E allora noi oggi stiamo parlando dei corridoi umanitari, per carità che ben vengano, però su un fenomeno epocale, che è quello che muove all'incirca 100, 200, 300.000 persone contemporaneamente che arrivano sui nostri territori e ci danno il contentino per dire vabbè sì, un corridoio umanitario forse si può aprire, o un corridoio universitario per fare studiare i ragazzi come sta facendo l'Università di Bologna, come ha fatto le città tedesche che si sono riuniti per cercare di dare un'accoglienza. Cioè dico io, è mai possibile che dopo tanti anni, ancora oggi, il fenomeno delle migrazioni non può essere discusso seriamente in Parlamento, al Parlamento europeo? E com'è possibile che i deputati che noi continuiamo ad eleggere da rappresentarci in Europa non sono nelle condizioni di fare una proposta seria per affrontare questo argomento?
So what each of us can do, each one of us, both locally, we all have a part to play, but also we hope that we can have a role to play more generally in a way that has more global results. But the reason that all of our efforts in the end don't come to much or are thwarted is that no one really has the strong intention to create regularized corridors for migrants and migration. Today, what do we speak about mainly? We speak about humanitarian corridors. But the phenomenon of migration is much bigger than this. Or, as is the case with Bologna, we talk about university corridors, a way for allowing people to study at university. Or with the German network and the German cities as well. It's very limited, our approach to these problems. Because it surprises me that after all of these years of watching the phenomenon of migration, we still don't manage to have a real discussion in the European Parliament and with European politicians about migration as it actually happens.
Sono stanco di...
Sorry, Mr. Martello, we would like to go on. That's okay. You get another chance in the second round of interventions. Thank you so much so far for all your inputs. I want to make a few remarks and then go over to the next round, where we look at corridors of solidarity in more detail and in more thinking way more about practical solutions. What I want to emphasize is, and what we already understood from the panelists, is that we really need to understand the needs of all the actors along corridors of solidarity. Mr. Martello already mentioned the situation and very intense situation regarding this fisherman. Maybe some of our attendees here saw the video. He rescued people while he was working, and of course, this is a very intense situation for him, and of course for everyone else who's involved in rescue missions. And on the other hand, I want to emphasize that the main actors are refugees and asylum seekers, and that we always have to reflect and think about including their voice and their ideas, and have them play the most active part in these corridors of solidarity. Because a lot of times we just speak about it and think about our European perspective, but the right of mobility is a right that refugees and asylum seekers have, and this is a right. It's a right where they can decide on their own where they want to live and where they want to go. Of course, what you said, Mr. Martello, I totally agree. Our organization is called Europe Must Act, and we, of course, look a lot on the European level. And we see that the discussions are really only focused on refugees and not migrants. And we see that that on EU level, there's no conclusion and that there's a gap. And that someone needs to fill this gap, because otherwise people suffer and people die. On the other hand, what we see if it comes to cities, something that Maximiliane already mentioned, what we see also at Europe Must Act with our Cities Must Act campaign is that the closer we come to cities, the closer we come to people who live in these cities and communities, the more we see that they understand their capacities and that they understand the real needs of people. Not only speaking about people who already live or were born in Munich, but also speaking about people who go there. Speaking about refugees and asylum seekers, they know what they want to do. Mr. Martello, you mentioned universities of solidarity or corridors to attend universities in Northern Europe. So people know what they want to do. They know which job they want to do. They know which life they want to live. And this is a strong reason for me and for us to promote the idea of corridors of solidarity and giving much more responsibilities to cities. And on the other hand, the close cooperation between civil society organizations and cities and municipalities is very important. I think, Maximiliane, we are going to speak about that in more detail later. And Maurice, I hope you can give an input on that as well, because that's what we see as well, that in cities and in areas where civil societies organizations are pushing the topic, authorities and municipalities are much more likely to take action, especially when it comes to unconventional and more creative ideas. At this point, I want to hand over to you, Maurice, and would like to ask you which role cities play in the concept of the simul MRCC.
Thanks, Christian. Just before I respond to that, I want to say that, not a critique at all, but the, idea that Europe must act, which is in the name, of course, of your organization as well, I think sometimes is a bit misleading, right? Europe is acting all the time, right? Europe is creating the conditions at sea. Europe is creating a death zone in the Mediterranean Sea. It's an active creation of Europe, right? So saying that Europe must act, we mean Europe must act differently, right? Europe must cease to, and this is what the mayor also said, Europe must cease to criminalize solidarity. Europe must cease to criminalize fishermen, people on the move, activists along corridors, right? And I think, we need to shift this to not believe in Europe as a sort of solution per se, right? Europe is nothing, does not have, as the mayor also said, any sort of positive horizon, right? Any political agenda that is progressive, that thinks about migration in a more holistic, in a progressive way, right? That does not reduce migration always to a threat, a risk, and builds a policy agenda around this risk, which only focuses on anti-smuggling, right? Which again, only affects the people who are actually trying to cross safely, right? So when we talk about the civil MRCC, the alarm phone, civil rescuers, we are asking of Europe to do more in certain ways, but also to cease doing what they are doing, which is criminalizing solidarity, leaving people to drown in the Mediterranean Sea, right? These are very concrete proposals. And we are also asking, and this connects to the point that you just raised, to allow people to disembark in places, in ports of safety, which can never be in Tripoli or elsewhere, but can only be in Italy, Malta, France, Spain, and so on. But then also allows people to move on, and as I said earlier, to reach other places of destination, right? Where they can find protection and safety, where they can build up lives, right? Not being threatened by detention and deportation, right? So solidarity cities are what we make of them, right? They are built through grassroots mobilization, through different new forms of solidarity that speak against these forms of repression that we see on the level of the state and the EU, right? The problem is that we see a sort of consensus that has emerged over many years now between the levels of the EU and the member states, even if they express it in slightly different languages, right? The states, always talk in very repressive or sovereign categories, while the EU is using humanitarian rhetoric, right? But of course, doing the same, which is the externalization of borders, the financing of Libyan militias, the reinforcement of anti-migrant policies, right? So we see these two levels of governance that in fact are very deeply interconnected. And so a approach from the bottom up, from the grassroots, from the social movements and municipalities and cities have to respond to these other levels of governance and say, well, you want to close borders, we welcome people, and we don't only welcome them so that they stay at the place of disembarkation, which we know are not necessarily the place where people want to stay, such as Lampedusa, but we generate corridors that connect, cities and allow people to travel to places where they want to be and live and build happy and dignified lives, right? So in order to do that, we need to strengthen this network, solidarity network of cities that foster these corridors. And again, as you rightly said, Christian, it's people find also their own way, right? So the corridors of solidarity are created by people on the move. And I think this is really crucial not to forget, right? But what can civil society, activists and so on do so that they are not facing deportation, detention, repression, but that they can actually find protection and safety and build a life in Europe, right? And the civil MRCC is part of this, right? The crossing from Northern Africa, for example, to Europe can never be safe, right? So this is the attempt to build some sort of more protective corridors, while noting that, of course, crossing the sea can never be safe, right? Even when Mare Nostrum was there and rescuing 150,000 people, thousands of people died. So even more rescue, even more activists, even more NGOs at sea will never stop people from drowning. And so what we need is, we are only a patch, right? A band-aid at the current moment in the Mediterranean Sea, but we should not exist at all, right? Sea rescue should not exist. People should not have to risk their lives to escape from hardship and to find a place of safety. But until then, we try to foster some sense of dignity and solidarity with people who are in distress in the Mediterranean Sea, so that we can see ourselves maybe as a small part of an existing migrant underground railroad that starts way before Libya and that ends way beyond Italy. Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, Maurice. Mr. Martello, I would like to ask you if you could give us your perspective on what you think Northern European cities should do or could do to help cities or regions or islands like Lampedusa, especially talking about safe harbor cities, the network which Maximiliane already mentioned, and you already mentioned it as well. And we would like to know your perspective. If there are capacities in other European countries, what do you think could they do to directly help you and your city and your community?
Your question was directed to us.
Oh, sorry.
La domanda è cosa possono fare le città fuori da Lampedusa e non eccetera, attivamente aiutare.
Volevo concludere il concetto di poco fa per ricollegarmi a questa domanda. Siamo stanchi di vedere un Mediterraneo pronunciare sempre la stessa parola, il Mediterraneo mare di morte. Dobbiamo avere il coraggio di dire per quale motivo il Mediterraneo è un mare di morte, perché c'è il disimpegno da parte di tutta l'Europa, compreso il governo italiano, che non riescono ad attivarsi per cercare di salvare le persone che affogano nel Mediterraneo. Non solo, ma addirittura speculano sulle organizzazioni non governative che di fatto svolgono questa attività, dove sembra che chi esce da un porto per andare a salvare le persone viene immediatamente messo sotto accusa, chissà quale arcano si nasconde dietro questa voglia di andare a salvare le persone. Ecco, dovremmo partire da lì per ribellarci, per fare sentire la nostra voce nei confronti dell'Italia, del governo e dei paesi europei. Perché se noi non vogliamo sentire più la parola morte, ci deve essere qualcuno che cerca di salvare e di non fare morire le persone.
So first, I just want to conclude speaking about a particular concept to also connect to the question. All of us, we're tired of hearing about the Mediterranean spoken as a sea of death. It's always spoken of in those terms. And we need to have the courage to ask why is the Mediterranean always spoken about as a sea of death. And the reason is there's a disinterest, there's a lack of intention from Europe and from Italy to stop this from happening. Not only is there a lack of interest, Europe and Italy actively speculate on the NGOs, they actively utilize the NGOs for their own ends, trying to say that there must be some strange, dark reason behind the desire of people who save lives. There must be some other motivation there. And that's where we need to start if we want to begin to rebel against these policies from both Italy and from the EU.
Cosa dobbiamo fare?
Sorry, one more question regarding this. So is there anything more practical you can think of? What I understand now is that you talk about the narrative and the way that Northern European cities or the EU itself looks at the Mediterranean and cities around there. So is there more concrete things you can think about? Like if you have the chance to talk to the mayor of Munich, for example, tomorrow, what would be your request to him if he says, we would like to help you?
Ma quello che possiamo fare noi come città di frontiera, ma come interessati, diciamo, al fenomeno del... cosa sarebbero le risposte alle altre città? Cosa possiamo fare? Possiamo fare una cosa semplice, che noi ogni tanto, ma quasi tutti, fanno finta che non esista. Esiste un documento dell'ONU che si chiama Global Compact for Migration. Questo documento ti mette nelle condizioni intanto di parlare in Europa, ma anche io parlo sempre nei confronti del governo italiano, del fenomeno delle migrazioni. E bisogna necessariamente partire da un punto fermo, perché se noi partiamo dalle nostre considerazioni o dalle considerazioni che fanno i partiti politici che ci stanno attualmente in Europa, noi non ci metteremo più attorno a un tavolo. A che cosa serve questo documento? Serve a mettere sempre attorno a un tavolo anche i paesi rivieraschi del Mediterraneo, parlo per la sponda africana, perché se noi dobbiamo riportare tutto alla normalità e alla regolarità o alla sicurezza, come qualcuno dice, c'è bisogno che parliamo della materia del contendere. E quindi quando io dicevo che bisogna necessariamente aprire i corridoi regolari, significa dietro accordi che si fanno anche con tutti i paesi africani, perché non può continuare ad esistere il flusso dei migranti che sia, come si dice, trasportato da delinquenti che cercano praticamente di sfruttarle e molte volte li fanno anche morire nel Mediterraneo. Ecco, bisogna avere la consapevolezza che l'Europa deve partire da un punto fermo. Se non si riesce a partire da lì, o comunque da un documento che sia condiviso, che sia, come dire, sfogliato anche dall'appartenenza politica, il fenomeno delle migrazioni continuerà ad essere sempre un'emergenza e francamente siamo stanchi dell'emergenza.
So I can start by talking about a very simple thing. There is a document by the United Nations called the Global Compact on Migration. And I think this document needs to stand at the center of discussions on a European level, but I always talk about an Italian level as well. Because if we just begin instead from what I think, what we think, from what the political parties think, we're not going to get anywhere. We have to have a shared point of view. So why do I talk about this document, the Global Compact? Because it can bring together the whole Mediterranean. So not just the European countries, but all of the countries and the African countries in the Mediterranean who need to be brought together. Because if we're saying we want to get back to, we want to have regular migration, we want to have corridors of migration which are can be managed and safe, as many people say, that means that that has to happen within deals and agreements. So when I speak about corridors of migration, I mean within international agreements. Otherwise, as the African countries know, we just continue with the current phenomenon of migration in which delinquents and human traffickers exploit people. and we continue down the same road. Unless we begin from a shared point of view between all the countries, migration will continue as it is now to always be an emergency.
La politica che c'è stata in questi anni, ma che continua ad esserci anche oggi, è sull'intimidire le persone, perché si semina e si continua a seminare odio, rancore, e difatti siamo dovuti stare molto attenti noi al fenomeno, diciamo, agli sbarchi dal momento in cui è scoppiato la pandemia. E allora bisogna come dire, cancellare questo falso allarmismo che viene provocato dai partiti sovranisti o da coloro i quali vogliono solo ed esclusivamente intimidire la gente, perché poi alla fine vogliono affermare quel principio razzista che esiste nelle menti distorte di questi soggetti che ancora oggi amministrano paesi in Europa. E quindi per cambiare questo sistema c'è bisogno di spogliarsi dall'appartenenza politica e c'è bisogno di parlare seriamente su quello che cerchiamo di portare avanti, anche in maniera sparsa in Europa, coloro i quali siamo interessati o siamo solidari al fenomeno dell'immigrazione.
Indeed, politics now is all about intimidation and fomenting hatred. And we've seen that over the past year. We've had to be extremely careful about the landings in Lampedusa all through the pandemic, because there is so much false information and false alarmism put around by sovereignist parties, which build on an underlying racism. If we want to go beyond this, which comes from political parties, which also some of whom still govern countries across Europe. So if we want to go beyond this, we need to detach ourselves from party politics and speak with everyone who wants to stand in solidarity with migrants.
Thank you very much for this input. And then I would like to hand over to you, Maximiliane, to directly try to answer. Yeah, as we heard, Mr. Martello was speaking about the narrative, speaking about racism, speaking about how others from the outside see the Mediterranean as a sea of death. And I would like to ask you what you think could be a way of tackling this situation. Of course, it's not a material sort of help. It's not money. It's not sending flights or buses or something like that. Is there idea from your side how you as a civil society organization, or maybe also the municipality of Munich, could support here?
Well, I guess one thing we could probably all agree on is that we not only need a different narrative and a different practice, but first of all, a different vision of what is Europe and how does Europe relate to migration. And this is also a point that popped up in the Q&A chat. I saw someone asking what's the difference between talking about migration or specifically talking about refugees and asylum seekers. Like, I guess as a matter of principle, like we need to say migration is part of our society. It's always been, and we need to find ways to push for this vision and to develop, like to change into a new way of looking at things and become a narrative that is feasible. And I reckon from my Northern European perspective, I would say here it's actually quite important that people in the first place build up an understanding that like Lampedusa, this is also our border. It's not just something we can leave to people in Lampedusa or generally in like Southern Europe, and that we have to come together and be more proactive about it. And I think like picking up on this differentiation between migration and refugees, again, it's I guess a lot of issues stem from the fact that we just try to on the European and national levels, all efforts are being blocked completely. And this is why I don't think this like network of safe harbors in Northern Europe, I don't think it's the answer to every problem we have, but I think it's one step, it's one attempt, it's one way of trying to push for a new vision by saying, like Maurice said, like we have these different governance levels, or like different levels where political decisions are being made, and very clearly, at least in Germany, on the local level, where actually the political work gets done and where the infrastructure is and all the knowledge and the resources are being put in, we have a large number of people saying, hey, we do not feel represented by whatever the EU is doing with its migration pact and so on. And I think that's important. And this is why I think also some symbolic actions could be an important part, like where this is just like one idea, but like, why does the mayor of Munich not directly go and like try to foster closer ties with cities in southern Italy and try to make it public, not just do it, oh yeah, we've passed this resolution calling ourselves safe harbor. No, you have to go out and promote the message. And I think this is also where I see the cooperation between Northern and like Southern European cities. It's one attempt, it's one way. It's definitely not the only one and not the final way of fixing things, but it's one way forward to, push for a more humane migration and also refugee policy. Like this is another issue that turned up. Like I think we need, like as Seebruecke, we look at the topic of migration and like asylum from one particular perspective, but obviously there's many other questions related to that where other groups or other people are more of an expert on. But certainly like a fair asylum process is essential if we want to create corridors where people can move and not just have fast track systems and hotspot camps. I don't know, does this answer your question? I don't know, maybe somebody else wants to add on to this, Maurice, or also Mr. Martello?
Yes, please, if you have ideas, just open your microphone.
Well, maybe just very briefly, because I see that we are running out of time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I'm very much critical of this duality of migration and or migrants and refugees, right? I don't think it is helpful, and I think in many ways it's unsustainable, right? When we think about the complexity of migration and displacement, when we think about, you know, global issues that we are facing at the moment, from poverty, from the environmental destruction of our planet, to you know, the lack of resources, you know, capitalist forms of exploitation, civil conflicts, and so on, right? We see that this idea, which is a very old idea, that seems able to distinguish between those who migrate sort of voluntarily and those who move involuntarily, is a dead end, right? So I'm very much against, you know, sort of categorizing and recategorizing, especially because the right of asylum is dying right before our eyes, right? So it's eroding already. So this ever more limited category of refugees, I think, is not the one we should use, right? We should think more expansively about people on the move and how to, you know, stand in solidarity with them, offer space of protection, and so on. And then, you know, what Maximiliane said is exactly right? We have to obviously create new systems that are not, you know, based on these forms of categorization, which means that a lot of people will be expelled again after, you know, reaching Europe, right? I mean, it's incredible what we see still on the Greek islands. It's shameful what we see in Malta's detention camps. It's terrible what we see on the Canary Islands in detention, also in Italy, floating hotspots, and so on, right? So there obviously needs to be a real dramatic shift in the ways in which we perceive of migration and policy making around it. And I think, you know, cities and grassroots movement and social movements have to lead the way, precisely because of what I said earlier. You will not find the solutions coming from the EU level or the state level.
Yeah, I would also like to emphasize the thing that you just said, Maximiliane, about the partnerships between cities. I already got this feeling yesterday and again today that that communication and talking to each other is very important. I think it was also a comment in the chat now. That it's not only about coming up with concrete ideas right now, but it's very much about establishing relationships, especially between people and cities from Northern and Southern European cities or countries. And that's what also Mr. Martello said. We need to discuss and we need to talk to each other, and all of this helps, or this discussion helps to tackle the narrative and to really understand what the situation is. For example, to understand the situation in Lampedusa for maybe the mayor of Munich. So I think this partnership concept, which is already in place, at least for a lot of German cities, could very easily be expanded to topics of migration and not only to economic things or topics that cities already talk about. Yeah, as you already said, Maurice, it's very sad we're running out of time. I think there's much more to discuss, and we should definitely continue this discussion in another panel. I would like to summarize and yeah, just recap a few points that we talked about today. Yeah, a very important thing and a core development is what Mr. Martello said, that Lampedusa sees twice as many people arriving as last year. And that the emergency, on the other hand, is not an emergency from a humanitarian perspective. It's an emergency of welcoming people. That's what Mr. Martello said. And yesterday, I think it was Mr. Mayor Schubert who said it's an emergency or a crisis of solidarity, which again is about communication. We need to communicate what solidarity really means and really understand the demands of each other. And then what you said, Maurice, I take this with me to our next Europe Must Act meetings, is that Europe must act differently. That's true. That's our discussion internally, of course, as well. Europe must act is on the one hand, yeah, a bad thing because they act in the wrong direction, and even not acting is a way of acting. Because yeah, people have to leave their homes and they're not stopping leaving their homes and coming to Europe because the EU does not have time or is not willing to discuss. They are still coming, and there's still the need to yeah, to come up with dignified reception conditions. Yeah, what you also said, Maurice, was to create networks of cities along these corridors, and these corridors are not only starting in cities or islands like Lampedusa. They start way before and they end way after Italy, for example, and they end in cities like Munich, for example. Again, we talked about the lack of interest, which Mr. Martello mentioned, and that the narrative needs to change, which is again a part of communicating with each other. And Mr. Martello mentioned that there's the Global Compact on Migration, and that there's that this is a document which exists and which we could use as a basis of discussion and as a basis of or for coming up with concrete solutions and ideas for corridors of solidarity. Yeah, Maximiliane, you said migration is part of our society, and that we need to understand that Lampedusa is also our border, speaking from a Northern European perspective. And yeah, that I think this is a very good conclusion. It's not very practical, but it's again a way of understanding the situation, and by understanding the situation, it's much easier to come up with concrete solutions, because a lot of people probably don't understand this complex situation. And if you don't understand this complex situation, you can definitely not come up with concrete solutions. I just checked the chat, and there was one very concrete solution or idea that maybe we could just campaign and ask companies, airplane companies, to check the passports of people when they enter planes. It's a very small thing on the one hand. On the other hand, it would have a big effect. But of course, there's always the question of legality, and yeah, of course, unconventional solutions still have to be legal. And again, this is something we need to discuss and discuss with authorities and cities to see that everyone is really supporting these ideas for corridors of solidarity. I would like to say thank you. It was a very interesting discussion. Again, it was not enough time to touch all the topics in detail, and I would love to come together with this round again to follow up on these topics. I would like to mention that there are 2 more panels tonight or this afternoon. 4:30, there is another panel on human rights violations by Frontex and the EU. And 5:30 this evening, there's a networking session for activists and civil society organizations. You can find the registration link online on our homepage, and I think on the social media channels as well. And everyone who registered for the Zoom call today is getting an email, a follow-up email with more information about what was said today. Thank you again for joining the call today. Thank you for our attendants or participants who were listening here on Zoom and Facebook. Have a great day, and maybe I meet some people in Palermo here today, and maybe the other persons on Lampedusa or in Munich one day. Have a great evening and a good time. Bye-bye.
Ciao. Thank you.
Bye.